Welcome to this video, which is designed to give you an overview of some of the main areas of study for maritime processes. It's not supposed to replace the work you've done in class and all of the notes that you've taken there, but it is supposed to hopefully also show you where various parts of the course overlap with other elements of history and geography that you're doing towards the OIB. So the contents of the presentation, I'm hoping to go through maritime flows, the general patterns, the concept of choke points. I'm going to try and link those patterns and choke points to globalization, the new international division of labour, and the role of transnational corporations. And we'll look at a couple of examples, which are Apple and Walmart. We're also going to look at changes to maritime flows that could be coming as a result of climate change, specifically in the Arctic. And then we'll have a zoom in to East China, which you'll see is the powerhouse of maritime processes globally. And we'll look at why East China has developed in this way, both through its topography and initial advantages, and then its acquired advantages, remembering that cumulative causation model there, looking at things such as special economic zones. And we'll also look at why, as a result of the development in this area, the South China Sea is becoming an area of geopolitical tension and conflict. So we start off by looking at the concept of global maritime trade, which has been around with us a long time. Here is a map of British global maritime trade going back to 1750, where you can see it was very much centered on that Atlantic triangle and burgeoning trade with East India at the time. So maritime trade has been around with us a long time, and the concept of global and globalized trade has been around with us a long time. It's by no means a new phenomenon. You can see here the ancient maritime trade route between Alexandria in Egypt and China from 250 BC to 250 AD. And you'll see this particular route reappear later on in the presentation as we look at China's new investments in globalizing their trade, their maritime trade. However, the modern pattern looks very much like this. And as you can see, it is centered on the powerhouse of Eastern China. This is container shipping routes, containerized shipping. And you can see that East China dominating most of the top 10, apart from Dubai, coming in at number 10. But even outside of that, going into the top 20, there's only 5 or 6 major ports outside of that Southeast Asian region on there. So you can see a very, very clear pattern, a pattern of China being the powerhouse. There being trade across towards Europe and North America, certainly, but not anywhere near in the amounts that there are over in East China. So we can start to see the impact of that Chinese export and this clear map here just over the last 20 years or so. Here was the top source country for imports in selected African countries in the year 2000. You can see that China was the main importing country for some of them, but France, South Africa had huge dominance across many. And you can see by 2020 just how much that trade from China is now starting to dominate imports into those countries. The actual volume is going up too. It's not just the geographical distribution. You can see, though, that the volume of international maritime traffic is still dominated by chemicals, oil, gas, and dry bulk in the form of food. There is a healthy container and trade in there too, but you can see that those primary resources, chemicals, oils, gas, and dry bulk dominate maritime trade. And that links very strongly to the new international division of labour, which we can start to see in the next couple of slides. Here are all the countries of the world classified by their main exports. And you can see down in Africa, it's dominated there by primary exports of precious metals, minerals, food and drink, oil. In this form will be mostly in the form of crude oil. You can also see oil obviously dominating through the Middle East as a primary export and up into Russia. And you can start to see as you go towards Europe and North America, higher valued goods, motor vehicles, parts, capital goods, machinery, transportation. And you can see China now starting to move into electronics and electronic equipment and machinery. But generally what you see is mostly primary production taking place in some of the poorer parts of the world, and secondary and tertiary production taking place in the richer parts of the world. And this is the kind of division of labour that we have. That division of labour can be clearly seen here in terms of a primary resource, which is oil. This is a map of oil and how it circulates throughout the world on shipping. By $1 million of barrels, barrels a year. You can see the Straits of Hormuz in the Middle East dominating that trade, and you can see it sweeping off towards China and Southeast Asia, and you can see it curving round and going up through various choke points there towards Europe and North America. And a choke point is where shipping is concentrated in a very, very narrow area, and here are the main oil transit choke points around the world: the Danish Straits, the Bosphorus, of course, the Straits of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandab, going up through into the Suez Canal towards Europe, and the Strait of Malacca, after the Strait of Hormuz, the second most important choke point on the planet. Why are choke points important? Choke points are important, of course, because they bring with them power. Controlling those choke points means you can control the oil supply to various parts of the world. And in the case of the Strait of Malacca, of course, can charge heavily for the pleasure of going through, and that also can generate income for countries, most notably there, of course, Singapore. The table to the right shows you the main oil choke points, main global choke points, in fact, and also the number of vessels per year going through, with Malacca dominating at 60,000 vessels a year, Strait of Hormuz 50,000, and the Bosphorus going to the Black Sea 50,000 also. But you can also see the shipping sizes, with the Bosphorus and the Suez Canal having a limit on 200 deadweight, 200,000 deadweight tonnage. But importantly, Hormuz and Bab el-Mandab are not constrained by the weight of the shipping, just by the width. It's a fairly narrow piece of land. And you can see there that the Panama Canal, by virtue of its inability to take high deadweight tonnage, has a reduced number of ships going through there. You can also see, interestingly, in the final column, what are the main perceived threats at those choke points. So you can see in the Strait of Hormuz regional instability in general, and terrorism also in the Suez Canal, terrorism and piracy in Malacca, and also in Bab el-Mandeb indicates there that there are concerns about the safety of shipping as it moves around the planet through those choke points, where, of course, that shipping can be extremely vulnerable. To zoom into the Straits of Hormuz, the reason for this slide is to give you some idea of just the complexity that there is around choke points, not just in terms of their narrowness, but also in terms of what actually is going on in the area. So the green shading there are oil fields and oil pipelines. The red are gas fields and gas pipelines. So you can see a complex interwoven network there of oil, gas, and pipelines, and various countries vying for those resources in the area. And the circle there around the actual Strait of Hormuz itself, showing you just how narrow it gets at its narrowest point. And interestingly, we then start to see why there is such geopolitical fascination with countries such as Iran, who have some element of control over that area. And also we reflect on the role that Oman plays in the Middle East, which has always been that of a neutral power broker, obviously keen to keep the Straits of Hormuz running for their own financial gain there too. So it gives you some idea of that they're not just narrow, that they are extremely complex political organisms. And we'll come back to look at some tension, some geopolitical tension in other parts of the world through maritime processes. This was a survey done of major maritime users in the maritime industry, where they were asked over the next 10 years what they thought were going to be the biggest challenges they would face. And you can see there on the table to the left, of course, the global economic crisis post-COVID was going to be one of them. The decarbonisation of shipping was going to be a huge challenge. The pandemic, of course, jumped up from nowhere. But as we get down to fourth and fifth position, we start to get to geopolitical tension. So geopolitical tension does sit higher than some other traditional challenges, such as fuel price increases, safety, piracy, terrorism. So we'll reflect on geopolitical tension at various choke points and various other parts of the maritime motorway that goes around the planet. And as you can see on the right-hand side, when we drill down into that, 73% of respondents from major maritime industries said that the pandemic also made geopolitical tension more likely, in particular an anticipated escalation in conflict between the US and China, and we'll reflect on how and where that might come about. This map is very, very simple, but very, very effective. The countries in blue are those countries whose gross domestic product is above the global average. The countries in orange are those which are below. And if ever you wanted a simpler graphic to show you the concept of core and periphery, then there probably isn't one. And this is the main driver behind the concept of the new international division of labour, as we've seen. And what we're going to look at now is one of the main drivers of that, which is transnational corporations and how they operate between the various countries. So if we were to look at the top 100 transnational corporations, you will see that from the map on the left, they are dominated. That map is centered around the North Pole. They are dominated by Europe, by North America, and by Japan, and a smattering in Southeast Asia. But Europe, North America, and Japan dominating the top 100 most powerful transnational corporations there. They are ranked by their foreign assets in millions of dollars. And you'll see some household names going down there, from oil companies through motor vehicle companies, supermarkets and other retail chains, and electronic companies. But no doubting, as we saw, that these transnational corporations are based in and their revenues are collected in some of the world's richest countries. And a good example of that is to look at Apple. This is not a new graphic. This is looking at, this was built around the iPhone 4S, but it just gives you a good idea of how transnational corporates can operate. So you can see over in the US, where the star is, that's Apple's main headquarters. That's where the research and development takes place. And that's where some of the more advanced components are produced there. And you can see those are the countries with Apple stores in them: Mexico, US, Canada, Brazil over there in the Americas. We move to Europe, and we can see there's some subcontracting of production to Germany. And again, you can see Europe's a huge market for Apple, with many of its stores being there. You can also see some subcontracting out to South Korea, to actually other companies such as LG and Samsung, who actually produce some of the components for the iPhone 4. So there is some of the high-tech research and development taking place in the US, and that's where the headquarters are. So obviously that's where the financial flows go back to. But you can see they subcontract out, and they supply components to Foxconn out in Southeast Asia, out there in China, where many of the assembling took place for the iPhone 4. The assembly plant was out there. And you can see there's kind of a ring round where most of the subcontractors are in producing the iPhone. So you've got the actual production taking place in those poorer areas, so that the wages can be kept low. Health and safety legislation is less strict. Working hours less tightly constrained, and basically the product can be produced for cheaper. But you can still see there some pretty well-established patterns of the maritime routes of the iPhone as they come back through the Straits of Malacca, back through the Suez Canal into Europe, and of course back across the Pacific towards the US, where they are sold in those stores. And this is a fairly common pattern for a transnational corporation where the high-end, high-value operations take place in economically more developed countries, and that producing of the actual product takes place in those economically less developed countries for those reasons we mentioned, which will help them to maximize their profits. Another good example is Walmart. Walmart, a major American supermarket chain. And you can see in green where they're very strongly established. The darker the green, the longer they've been established, going back to 1962. Yellow, lighter colours moving towards they're starting to expand down there into Africa and into Southeast Asia, into India, and they've been in China. But what's interesting is the areas shaded blue, either through lines or solid. Those are the main suppliers of manufactured products. And although there's Spain there as an anomaly in Europe, Spain, however, one of the cheaper labour markets in Europe, you can see that those labour markets are down there in Mexico and Brazil and Chile, India, China, and down again through Southeast Asia, through Indonesia and areas around there, the Philippines. So you can see again this pattern that Walmart, having well-established stores in high revenue markets such as the US, Canada, growing into new emerging markets such as Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, China, but very much that production being kept cheap by the fact that it's being produced in low wage markets there out in Asia. So another key area that's going to become important for maritime processes in the coming years is the Arctic. This page here is taken from an excellent report that was done by the British government called Responding to a Changing Arctic. And it's a source of great interest. Primarily, if you look at the circle in the centre of the page, you can see the reduction in pack ice at the North Pole that there is in September, which is at the start of the winter. You can see in 1980 the North Pole dominated that, but by 2012 the area around the North Pole where there is sea ice greatly diminished by around about 50%. So you can also see on the graph to the left that not only is the extent going down, but the thickness is being reduced of the ice that is there, and also air temperatures from 1900 to 2014 are on that steady upward trajectory. What is the impact of the Arctic changing in this way? Well, it's going to allow more shipping. It's going to reveal oil and gas areas, resources. Tourism is starting to increase, particularly cruise ships in and around that area. Look at the landscape. It's obviously going to have a huge impact on the ecosystems of things such as the polar bears. It's going to open up new fisheries, new areas for fishery. And also, it's going to start having an impact on the people who live in and around the Arctic. We've already seen that some communities have had to be abandoned because of the lack of ice, and also how it's impacting on permafrost with subsidence affecting many areas there. So this restriction in ice is already starting to have an impact, but will have a huge impact on the maritime trade. Again, on the left there, you can start to see the pack ice that there is at the North Pole, 1986 to 2005 average, shows you the difference between February and September. But by 2081 to 2100 in February, it will only be around the coastal areas, and actually in September, there will be none at all, thus leaving open water in the Arctic. Currently, Russia dominates the Arctic region, as you can see there by the simple availability of vessels, major icebreakers. They have 40. The next largest fleet is Sweden with just 6. So Russia has got the ability at the moment to dominate this area, but as it becomes more and more open, of course, more countries in and around it are going to want to sail through it and maybe even start to stake a claim on some of the assets that there are there. We come back to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese BRI, which we know is a huge major investment by the Chinese government. It's part of their attempt to continue to be a global powerhouse in terms of a globalized economy. And again, we see those maritime routes, don't we, reflecting those great Alexandria to China routes from 250, from going back to 250 BC. But of course, you can see there as they're trying to get across to Europe that actually, if the Arctic was to open, the polar road, as it becomes known, going up over the Arctic, will mean that they'll be able to sail from China to Europe in less than half the time, limiting it from something in the region of 56 days, maybe down to as low as 18 at current estimates. So although there's a huge investment going here, of course, the Arctic could provide an even greater opportunity for that globalized trade. These are particularly interesting diagrams. So on the top, this is 2015 to 2030. These are estimates of shipping in terms of what would happen at the North Pole if we were to follow the Paris Protocol in terms of reduced emissions, or if we weren't. The pink are PC vessels, polar class vessels, vessels capable of cutting through ice, mostly thinner ice at the North Pole. OW are open water normal vessels that we would see taking part in maritime trade at the minute. And it's showing there a hypothetical route through from China over into Europe. And as you can see, by 2045 to 2060, if the Paris Protocol isn't followed, 82% of all of the vessels that sail across the North Pole would be able to be open water standard vessels as they are now. You can see if the Paris Protocol was followed, then it would drop down to 59%, thus giving an advantage to countries who've got that kind of ice-breaking capability. So again, response to things such as the Paris Protocol will have an impact on what happens up at the North Pole and over the Arctic. But certainly, if we continue to heat the atmosphere as we do at present, by 2045, which is not that long away, then about 82% of standard open water vessels will be able to cross that Arctic route. That obviously is going to raise tensions and also going to have a huge impact. And it's something that is going to have to be dealt with by the UN using its current protocols. But there have been attempts by the International Maritime Organization to try to introduce a code of conduct for the Arctic called the Polar Code, where they're already trying to think about the environment and ship safety in there. And you can see there some of the illustrative guides that they're producing. So there is already one eye on the Arctic. People are already trying to put in place, although albeit from the IMO, it's voluntary at this stage, it's just a code of conduct. But there will be increasing work to be done and increasing tension, no doubt, as climate change brings changes to the Arctic. However, for now, we focus back on Eastern China, where we know that we have the powerhouse of global maritime trade. And what's interesting here on the left is to look at some of the topography of the region. It's a common misconception that just simply being near the coast is enough for you to access the global economy. And it's a common answer from students when they're asked what is required. And they zoom right in there on that. Well, you need to have a coastline, and as long as you've got a coastline, all is good. It's a little bit more complex than that, and it's the type of coastline. So as you can see there, that deep water, relatively deep water, runs quite close to the Chinese coast, allowing those larger vessels to safely navigate that area. And you can see the arrows on there showing some of the natural ocean currents which help larger ships to come in and also help to power those ships out. So daily there are daily changes in the tide, obviously, as you can see on the right-hand side in the small box B and C, that help ships come in at various times of the day. But also there are helpful ocean currents, and those sweeping open ocean currents along the coastline take sediment away from the rivers, from the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, and leave good open deep water right up to the coastline. As you can see on that topographical map there, also a lot of open flat land existing there. So there's a huge initial advantage there. The Chinese have been working hard in terms of acquired advantage. If you look to the right-hand side there, you can see some aerial photographs and diagrams of how they've tried to reclaim land to try to create a type of coastline rather than just relying on the natural coastline, but trying to create a type of coastline that can maximize modern container shipping. And when you look closely at those aerial photographs, you can see some of those constructs there. And here you can see when you zoom right into the coastline just off Taiwan, off the Taiwan Strait, you can see how they have constructed ports and infrastructure all the way right up to the coastline in various places so that you can maximize shipping coming in, reclaiming parts of land to create artificial harbors and quaysides to allow that container shipping to come in and take advantage of those huge swathes of flat land, which are then required both for storage and for moving goods in and out of the area. So a lot of natural advantages, but also a lot of acquired advantages and huge investment by the Chinese state. So it's not just a case of being near the coastline. It's also important that that investment takes place. As a result, where that investment has taken place, you can see the size of the trade. Also, there are now a growth of inland ports following rivers that are going in, and in some cases, following roadways and railways, where those ports can then come through and feed those major seaports. And you can see as a result the billions of dollars that is being generated by those eastern regions. And as a result, there has been some positive impact, a positive cumulative causation, a positive multiplier effect on those regions. And you can see there the hinterlands, which are areas where there has been industrial and economic growth and higher standards of living based around the trade of those ports. But as we know from what we've studied, that kind of spread effect over into central and western China yet to be fully felt. And that was part of the reason for the Belt and Road Initiative to try to increase those benefits across central and western China. So that's shows you how the initial and acquired advantages have worked together. Another main acquired advantage has been that of the SEZ, the Special Economic Zone, which allows tax breaks and government funding and government support for those areas. And you can see how that was focused initially on much of the eastern coast and also on some of the delta areas. You can see more recently, of course, there's been attempts to try to spread that investment to other parts of the country to try to deal with the overheating, both economically, environmentally, and one could argue socially in those huge metropolises of eastern China on the coast there. So don't forget, we have a combination of things coming together that makes China's development so rapid in this area. We have those natural initial advantages. we have those positive multiplier effects that inevitably come with cumulative causation, but we've also got the government supercharging them by the installation of special economic zones. And as we've seen in China now, I think there's a great deal of reflection as to whether that has that rapid economic growth of Eastern China is coming now at a cost to the rest of the country, and there are attempts to try to balance that out with some of the regional strategies. As you can see there, as a result, it kind of summarizes it neatly that the SEZs and economic development zones along the coast and now have become, over the most recent decades, destinations for a massive rural to urban shift in the country. And as we've said, that inevitable inflationary overheating that you can get in Eastern China, which can start to threaten their economic competitiveness. So the government there is very keen to try to balance that out and try to spread the positive effects throughout the rest of the country. Finally, we look at the South China Sea. So those goods that come out of Eastern China then sail south towards the Straits of Malacca. And the South China Sea is a very, very complex area and kind of gives us a little precursor of what the Arctic may look like in time, because the South China Sea has been a disputed area for a long time now. Chinese fishermen and fishermen in general occupying these waters since 200 BC in some cases, with ports and settlements being set up by various countries. Of course, we know that the UN have got their rules about exclusive economic zones, and they are shaded on there in the various colors. So you can see the Vietnamese waters in blue, you can see the Philippine waters in purple, you can see the Malaysian waters in green there. However, you can also see superimposed on that the 9-dash line, which has been established by the Chinese government for a long time now, which is what they regard to be their natural sphere of influence based on their historical operations in that area. So we have huge overlapping areas. Why would this be a problem? It's probably a problem for 4 main reasons. The first reason is that we believe there's a lot of oil in the area. You can see a Chinese oil rig there. Oil reserves are huge, along with gas reserves, and along with there's always been massive fish stocks in the area too. As well as that, of course, as we've seen right from the very start, this is now a major part of the global maritime trading route. So a lot of shared interests come together here. The Philippines has been a US colony in its past. And as you can see there from some of the boxes, the US has got huge military bases in the area, and also they regularly fly and monitor much of the international airspace over this area. You can see the Chinese are slowly trying to develop their influence in the area in terms of oil and gas and their own military presence in the area. And that comes in direct conflict with countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, who also are staking their own claim on fish, oil, and gas stocks in the area. So this is a huge area of geopolitical tension, and also, as we've said, it's a major global maritime route. The presence of Taiwan in the top of the screen cannot go without mention. Of course, Taiwan, the main aim of, or one of the main aims of the People's Republic of China is to reunite Taiwan with the mainland as part of the greater People's Republic of China. So as well as the military and geopolitical tensions there, the South China Sea is a tinderbox, really, that could go off at any minute. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of competing interests, making it a very, very complex environment. You can see this is the famous Mischief Reef, which was a very small reef in the Spratly Islands, which you can see there the Chinese government have built an airstrip on. And if you can make out a port, and military vessels regularly dock there, and military planes really take off. As the Chinese have slowly started to try to assert their control over an area they believe historically has always been within their sphere of influence, and obviously due to their dominance of modern maritime trade routes, an area that's very, very important to them. So that brings to a conclusion our little tour. So we've covered some major maritime flows and patterns, the concept of choke points, some of the major choke points. We've looked at how those patterns link to globalization, the new international division of labour, the role of transnational corporations. We looked at a couple of examples there. And we're looking at how those maritime flows are going to change in the coming years as climate change is going to bring changes to the Arctic. Got a nice little East China case study, which you did right back in premiere. And don't forget, it's not just a case of here we are, we have a coastline, therefore we can access global trade. It's the topography has got to be very specific. It's got to allow deep water, lots of flat land, good ocean currents that allow for those huge modern container ships to dock and to sail in and out of there. As well as that, then we've got the role of acquired advantages. So the kind of land reclamation that the Chinese government has done, the huge investment they've made, as well as the establishment of special economic zones to try and really kickstart that positive multiplier effect. And also an area as important as East China, this powerhouse of the global maritime industry, of course, is going to bring with it inevitably tensions and conflict in the coming years. Okay. So I hope that's been a help. Don't forget, it's not supposed to replace your work, but it's a nice little tour through some of the main areas, and hopefully you can start to see where elements of your course are now linking together nicely. Thank you very much.